Hey guys, it is said that the hardest part of fixing a problem is to identify where the problem is. This statement is especially true when it comes to fixing an error in your program. In this video, we shall understand how to use logging module in Python. This can really be helpful when you're trying to figure out which section of your code is actually causing an issue. Logging is generally used to debug your code. What is debug? Debug is a feature that lets you track step-by-step execution of your program. So let's say you have a program which is causing an error, or you have a program whose output is not as per your expectations, then you will need to debug this program in order to identify which section or which part of your code is actually causing an issue. There are several tools that we can use for debugging, but logging messages is arguably one of the most efficient ways to debug your code. We can place different logging messages in different sections of the code, and then based on the recorded log message, we will be able to identify or narrow down the section of the code which might be causing an issue. Once we identify the section of the code which is causing an issue, it's pretty easy to fix the issue. Let's look at some practical examples to understand this further. But before I start writing the program, if you like this video, then please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you, and let's begin. As you can see, I have already written a program here. In this program, I have a function by the name nameCheck. So this function will accept one input parameter that is of a name, and it's going to check if the name is valid or not. So it's going to do this check based on the length of the name, if the name has special characters or not, etc, etc. So let's not worry about how this program is written. We are only focused on how we are going to use log message here. Currently, I'm not using any log message. So I'm calling this function from down here, and I'm passing a name as an input parameter. And then whatever is getting returned from this function, I'm just going to print it. Okay. So to start with, let's say I'm just passing the name as Alexander. And if I execute this program, you can see that the program is executed and it's saying name is valid. Okay, now let's go ahead and change this name to something else. So let's say I make it Alexander123, and if I execute this, it's saying invalid name. So now let's say I wanted to identify from which section of the code this message is actually being returned, because this invalid name in my code, you can see here, I have it here, I have it also here, and I have it also here. So from these three different sections, this return statement would have come. But in order to identify that, it would not be possible just by looking at the code. In this case, maybe it is possible because it's a very simple program. But in the real world scenario, when you're writing programs which may be hundreds or thousands of lines long, then going through each line of the code to identify from where a particular section of the code was executed would almost be an impossible task. And this is where we are trying to use log message. So when I say log message, it's basically a message that I'm going to pass in different sections of the code. Then based on this log message, I'll be able to identify which section of the code was actually executed. Okay, so if you're a beginner in Python, then probably you would simply use a print statement to capture this kind of log. But this is actually not the best way to do logging, and I'm going to tell you why. So first, let's see how we can use print here. Okay, so let me just uncomment these print statements. Okay, so I have uncommented this print. Now, if I execute this, let me just clear this and execute this. You can see that it's saying invalid name. And then on top of that, I have this failed all checks. So now if I search for this message, you can see that in this program, failed all checks is actually here. So now you will be able to identify that, okay, this return statement was actually returned after executing this section of the code. Now, this is fine. So we have used print statement to kind of record a log, and then based on that, we are able to identify which section of the code was being executed. But as I told you, print is actually not recommended to be used as a log message. Basically, we use print whenever we want to print some output to the user, something like, let's say, the program is executed successfully, or if you want the user to enter some values, then we can use print. But when recording certain logs, we should not be using print. And the reason for that is, so let's say you have written your program, and in this case, it's a small program, but in the real world, if you have written a big program, and then you have used tens of hundreds of different print statements to record a log, After you have finished your testing, and once you know that the program is fine, it's ready to be committed, you will need to manually delete all of these print statements from your program, because you would not want all of these unnecessary, basically junk values, to be committed into a production environment, correct? So in that case, when you're trying to manually delete these print statements, you might end up deleting certain print statements which were actually required for your program. So this is an additional overhead that you will need to do when you're using print. And secondly, let's say you didn't want to delete the print statements, you wanted to commit it as it is. Then the problem is your program will always print the values that are mentioned in this print statement. So this may be garbage values which you just wanted for testing some piece of code, and now it's committed to the production environment, which actually may not be the best thing to do for your software. So that is why we should not be using print. And instead of print in Python, we have a module called as logging. So in order to use this module, we can just say import logging. After this, I just need to do one configuration. So I just need to say logging.basic config, and here I am just going to set the level of my logging into debug. So I'm going to explain you what this level is and what debug is. But for now, let's say I just write it like logging.debug. That's all. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace these print statements with my logging statement. Okay, so I just say logging.debug. Okay, so not here. Okay, so what I have basically done here is I'm just importing my logging module. I have done some basic configuration where I have set the logging level equal to debug, and then I have replaced the print statement and passed logging.debug. Okay, that's all. So now if I execute this program, let me just clear this, and if I execute this program, you can see that it's printing invalid name, and on top of that it's printing our message that is failed all checks. But along with that, there are a few other additional information as well, and I'm going to talk about that in a short while. Now, you might ask, how is this different from print? Because when we used print also, it printed some statement, and when we are using logging also, it's printing some statements. Now, I'm going to give you two usages of using logging over print. So the number one is that, okay, here I have printed the output or the logged messages into my screen. But let's say if I didn't want this to happen, and instead of this, I wanted all the log messages to be captured into a file, then what I can do is I can configure a file name here. So I say file name equal to, give some name. So let's say I'm going to give the name like demo.log. Okay, I'm going to save it, and now let me execute it. But before that, let me just show you what I have in this folder. So in this folder, I have nothing like demo.log file. So when I execute this, you can see that it's just saying invalid name. So the logged messages that was being printed here is now no longer showing in my output. But then there is a new file that is demo.log that has been created. If I go into this file, you can see that it's basically having my log message. So this is one advantage of using logging over print. The second thing is, I told you, once you finished all your testing and debugging, before you commit your code into production, you may have to delete all the print statements. But when it comes to logging, you will not have to delete all these debug or logging statements. The reason for that is you have the option of disabling logging. How you can do that is just by passing a statement like logging dot disable. That's all. So I can also pass logging levels here, but for now I'm just going to keep it like this. So when I do this, and if I execute this program, okay, before that I'm just going to delete this log just so it becomes clear to you. And if I execute this program now, you can see that it's saying invalid name, no log message has been shown here. If I go to my log file, the log file is created, but there is nothing printed here. There is nothing written here. And the reason for that is I have disabled the logging. So this is very useful. So you might have hundreds and thousands of lines of program, and you have written, let's say, hundreds of different logging statements. When you're trying to commit it into production environment, then you don't need to really remove all these debug statements. You can just do a disable. So if you didn't want to print your logged messages, then you can just disable it. And let's say in future, if someone else wanted to use the same program to do some debugging, they just will take this code and then comment out this particular piece of line, and then all the debug statements can be reused. This is the advantage of using logging over print statements. Now, if I execute this program again, just to show you the log file. So if I see the log file, you can see that this is a message that I mentioned, but then you also have something like debug here. This is basically the logging level. Now in Python, we have 5 different logging levels, as you can see here. So we have debug, we have info, warning, error, and critical, and these are all in hierarchical order. So meaning that debug is the lowest level, whereas critical is the highest level. So each of these levels will have a value, something like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So I'm going to tell you how it's going to impact the debug statements or the logging statement that we are going to use in our program. Now, to explain this further, what I'm going to do is, let me just comment out this line of code, and then I'm just going to have another block of code here. So what I'm doing here is, I have all the 5 statements for each of the logging levels. So I have logging.debug, info, warning, error, critical, and I have different messages for each of these statements. Okay, so as I told you, the default logging level will be warning if I did not mention a level here. Now, if I execute this program, so let me just clear this. And before that, before I show you this, there's one more argument that I can use, and that is file mode. So let's say by default, the file mode for the file that is mentioned here, the file mode by default will be append. So every time I execute, the log messages will keep on appending. But I can change that to W. This means write. So every time I execute, the log file will be recreated and all the previous data will be erased. So for now, I want that to happen. So I'm just using file mode equal to W. And now let's say if I execute this program, okay, so I'll just run this. And if I go into my demo.log, you can see that warning, error, and critical messages are being displayed. The reason for that is, by default, the logging level here is warning. So all the statements that is including warning and after warning will be printed. This is based on the hierarchy of logging level. Since warning is 30, everything after 30 will be considered. So let's say instead of that, if I just mentioned here like level equal to logging dot error, then what happens is everything after error will be considered. That is 40 and 50, that is error and critical. So if I execute this program, and if I go here, you can see that only error and critical is shown here. So in the same way, let's say if I, instead of error, if I just put info, and now if I execute this program, you can see that everything after info is being printed. So info, warning, error, and critical. Okay, so this is the significance of different logging levels. Now, you might ask, why do we have 5 different levels of logging when basically all of these logging statements are basically going to print a particular statement into the log file, right? Now, the reason for that is, depending on where you want to print a message, you may use different types of logging level. For example, if you wanted to print a message related to an error in your program, then you could use logging.error. Now, this generally we would use it inside an exception block. So it's like your program has thrown an exception. So one particular section of your code has gone into exception, but it actually not stopping the whole of your program. In this case, we can just record that message using the error. But let's say there is an exception that occurred in your program, which basically is making your whole program to crash. So in that case, we can just say it's like a critical message, critical error. So I'm just going to record such messages or statements into the logging.critical statement. And let's say if in your program there are some issues which is currently not causing any errors, but in future it might cause some errors. So this can be a warning, and this kind of warning messages can be recorded by using the logging.warning statement. And we generally use info whenever we want to record some information, something like, let's say, a start of a program or an end of a program or something like that. And debug is generally used for almost all the simple details. So any debugging of any piece of code, then we generally would use debug. So depending on the different levels that we are going to use in our message, it would be very easy for any third person looking at our log file to identify this log message indicates that there is an error, this log message indicates that there is a warning, etc., etc. So that is why we have different types of levels in logging, and it's up to you how you are going to use or configure your log messages in your program. So now we have seen what these logging levels are. There's one more thing here, that is root. I'll come to that in a while. But before that, if you see here, this message that is being printed, this is in the default format. When I configured this logger, I did not mention any format for the message, but actually I can do that. So what I can do is, so in order to specify a format in which I want the messages to be displayed, I can just say format equal to, and then provide a format. Now, to provide a format, I can just refer to the python.org website. I'll leave a link to this in the description below. So here I have all the different formats that I can use when I'm trying to log a message. So for now, let's say if I wanted to record the time when that particular statement was executed, I can just say this one, that is percentage ASC time and yes. Okay, so after that, let's say I'm going to just leave a dash, and then I want to record the level name. So the level name, I can just copy and paste this one, and then finally I also want to record the message, so I just copy this and then I paste it here. Okay, so now if I just execute this program, and what I'm going to do is, I don't want the mode to be W now. I'll just remove this. So let the mode the file mode be append again. So if I execute this, and if I look at my log file, you can see that the previous messages are still there. So since I changed it from W, I removed that file mode. Now the default file mode will be append. So all the log messages will be appended to the same file. And you can see the new messages that have been printed here is basically in a different format. So first I have the time, so this is the date and time, and this after comma is the milliseconds, and then I have my logging level, and then finally I have my message. So I can specify any format for the message that I want to print, and I can use all the keywords that are mentioned in the python.org website. So I hope this was clear, and what we have done is we have imported logging, we have done some basic configuration, and then we have seen different levels of logging and seen based on what the logging level that is set, what kind of messages will be displayed. There's one last thing that I wanted to show you is that I told you we have this root mentioned here. This root is basically the default logger name. Logger is basically an object that is used to log your messages. So by default, the logger is going to be root, and that is why it's printing root here. Now we can specify our own logger, and I'm going to talk about that in a while. So if you're trying to use logging into a single program or just some sample program, then it's okay if you would like to use this basic config way of configuring your root logger. But this is actually not the recommended way. There is a drawback of using this root logger in your program, and I'm going to explain you what that drawback is. So for example, I have written two other programs here. So the first one is, if I just close this, the first one is save to file.py. So inside this program, I'm already using logging, and this logging is exactly the same way that I have done here. So what basically this program is doing is, I have two functions here. First is name check. Again, this is basically to check the validity of the name. And then I have another function here, which is basically save data. So this save data is, I'll enter the details like name, age, and email, and whatever I enter, it's going to store that details into a file that is data.txt. Okay, so let's not worry about how I have written this program and what this exactly is doing. We are more focused on how we are going to use log messages here. So along with these two functions in this program, I'm also what I'm doing is I have imported logging module, and then I have done some basic configuration for my root logger. Then I have another program here which is called as employee.py. Inside this program, what I'm doing is I'm actually importing my own program, that is save to file. So the program that I written here, I'm actually importing that. So I'm just saying save to file, and then I'm passing an alias as stf. And then I'm again using logging to configure the root logger and passing some debug statements. And then I have some three variables where I'm capturing name, age, and email. And then what I'm doing is I'm doing a check here. So I'm calling the function that is created in this save to file program, and I'm passing this name that I initialized here. So if that name is a valid name, it's going to return true. And if it is true, then I want to save that name along with the other details, age and email, into a file. Okay, that one I'm doing by calling this function save data. And let's say if the given name is an invalid name, then I want it to record a critical message in my log file saying that employee check failed. When I execute this program, what I want is all the log messages that is present in the employee.py should be captured under my log file employee.log, and then all the log messages that is present in this program, that is save to file.py, I want it to be captured under my log file save to file.log. Okay, this is what I want to do. Now I'm going to execute this from the employee.py. So if I execute this, you can see that it is executed. It's telling details saved successfully. And if I see on the left hand side, there is this data.txt file created, and this is basically storing the details that I passed. So I passed here as name, age, and email, and that name, age, and email is being saved into this file. This is fine. But if I look closely here, I have a log file created that is save to file.log, and this file is basically created from my program save to file.py, and this is fine. But in my employee.py file, I was expecting there should have been another log file created that is employee.log, but you see here there is nowhere employee.log file. And this is the problem of using root logger to record our logging messages. What actually happened here is that when I executed the employee.py file, if you are not aware, the import statement, whenever you try to import any program, it will straight away execute that program. So the first thing that would execute in this program is import logging. So after that, it would execute this program that I have created myself, save to file. And inside this program, if you see, I'm actually already configuring an root logger. So inside this, I'm passing the file name to be save to file.log, I'm passing the level to be debug, and I'm passing the format of the message. And then I'm recording some log messages. Once this import program is executed, the next thing it will do is it will try to run this basic configuration. But the problem with root logger, or the functionality of root logger, is during the execution of the program, once the root logger is configured, it's not going to overwrite this configuration. Meaning that when I executed this program, it called to save to file, it went here, and then here it already configured my root logger with all the details that I mentioned here. So the file name is this, level is this, and format is this. And after this, when it comes to this line to execute this basic config, it already knows that the root logger is already configured. So basically, this line will never be executed. It will just ignore this line. And that is why employee.log file was never created. So all the log messages that were used here, this logging.debug, start of employee program, end of employee program, will actually get captured to the root logger that was already created here, that is the save to file.log. My intention was to create two log files, one log file for each of this program, but since I'm using the root logger, it's only creating one log file that is saved to file, and all the log message from both these programs are getting saved into this file. So to avoid that, what we can do is, instead of using root logger, we can actually configure our own logger for each of our program. It's actually pretty easy to create our own logger in each of our programs. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a variable called as logger, and then I'm just going to say logging.getLogger, and here I can just pass any logger name. So by default, the logger name was root that was configured from here. Here I can just pass any name that I want, but it is recommended the name to be used is __name __. Now this is a special variable in Python. What value this variable is going to have is, if I execute this program from here, then this would have the value like __main __. But let's say if I executed this program from some other program, that is what I'm going to do now, that is from the employee program, this save to file will get executed. In this case, the __name ___ variable would get the name of this program that is saved to file. So I have created my logger. The next thing is to set the logger level. So what I'm basically going to do is, all this configuration, so all the basic configuration that I did here, that is I set a file name for my log, I set the logging level, and then I gave a format for the log messages. This same configurations I'm trying to do with my own logger here. Okay, so I've created my logger. Next, to set the logger level, I'm just going to say logger dot set level, and I'm going to pass like logging dot debug. Okay, so my logger is created. I have set the logger level to debug. The next thing is, let's say, the format of the message. In order to format the message, I'm just going to say a variable ef, and I'm going to say like logging dot formatter, and here I'm just going to pass the same format. So I'll just copy this same thing. Okay, and I'm just going to paste it here. So I'll follow the same format, and then once my format is set, the next thing is I need to set this file. So in order to set this log file, I need to create a file handler. So I'm just going to name a variable like fh, and I'm going to say logging dot file handler, and inside this I'm going to pass the same file name. So I'll just copy this, and I'm going to pass it here. So my file handler has been set pointing to this file, and then what I'm going to do is I've created this file. Now this file, the messages that are going to get printed into this file needs to follow this format. So to do that, what I'm going to say is fh dot set formatter, and just pass the variable name which is having the message format, that is ef. Okay, so what I have done is I have created the logger, I have set the level of the logger to debug, I have created a formatter, and then I have created a file handler pointing to this file, and that file handler I have set the formatter to the format that I created here. And then finally what I need to do is the file handler that I created here, I need to add it into my logger. So to do that, I can just say logger dot add handler, and then I just pass fh. Okay, so that's all. So these steps might seem a little confusing in the beginning, but it's pretty straightforward, and this is just one-time configuration. So you just configure it once and you're good to go. Now that's one additional thing that you need to do. Since I have now changed my root logger into this logger that I'm creating here, and I'm assigning this logger into this variable logger, I need to use logger instead of logging everywhere. Okay, this statement I can just comment out because I'm no longer using the root logger, and then everywhere else, wherever I'm using the logging statement, I need to replace logging with logger. So let me do that. Okay, so I have done that. I have now replaced all the logging statements with the logger, as you can see here. So everything is like logger.debug, logger.error, etc. Okay, so that's all. And now I'm just going to do the same in my other program, that is employee.py. So here I'll just copy paste that. And what I'm going to change here is I want the log file name to be employee.log, and the message format, I'll just copy this message format that I have here. So if I just paste it here, and that's all. So everything else stays the same. So let me just comment out this root logger configuration, and then everywhere wherever I'm using logging, I need to replace it with logger. So I'll just do that, and let me execute this program now. So I executed this program, it's telling details saved successfully, and now you can see that I have two log files created. So save to file.log. If I open that, this is all the log messages that was captured from my save to file .log. So all the log messages that were mentioned here, all these messages would get saved into this file, that is save to file. And then I have another log message, a log file, that is employee.log. And these are all the log messages that were created from this particular program, that is employee.py. Okay, so I hope this was clear. This is how we have configured our own logger and then specified each logger to each of our program. So I hope this was clear. If you have any doubts, then please make sure to leave a comment below. I'll try to answer as much as possible. Thank you and have a nice day.